Where are you watching from? Comment below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. If this story moved you, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Your support helps bring more powerful and exciting stories to life. Now stay tuned, because this twist will keep you hooked from beginning to end. Let's dive in. Santiago Ferrer never thought he'd regret a bet, but this was different. It started as a cruel joke, an arrogant billionaire accepting a reckless challenge to marry a woman completely outside his world. No love, no attraction, just 6 months and a contract. He thought it would be easy, tolerate her, win the bet, and walk away with his pride intact. But he had no idea what he was getting himself into, because Valeria Montemayor was nothing like the women in his life. She wasn't impressed by his money, didn't bend to his will, and certainly didn't care about his reputation. She was everything he never wanted, and everything he never knew he needed. The world mocked him. His business partners whispered behind his back, "Why her?" They didn't see what was coming. They didn't see the transformation that would leave everyone speechless. Because Valeria wasn't just another woman. She was a force, and as Santiago fought to maintain control, he found himself losing to her. But this wasn't just about an unbelievable twist in their marriage. This wasn't just about a shocking transformation that left Santiago stunned. This was about a man who thought he had it all, until he realized he had nothing. And when the truth was finally revealed, no one expected what happened next, because by the time the bet was over, Santiago wasn't sure who had really won. And when Valeria finally took off her mask, figuratively and literally, the world gasped. Santiago Ferrer had spent years convincing himself that power was everything. And in many ways, he was right. Power had bought him respect, turned his name into a brand, and placed him in rooms where billionaires shaped the world. He had conquered markets, crushed competitors, and built an empire so vast that his wealth felt inevitable. And yet, on nights like this, alone in his penthouse, staring out over the glittering cityscape, he couldn't ignore the emptiness pressing against his ribs. He had everything, or at least that's what the world thought. A fleet of luxury cars, a penthouse in Manhattan, a rotating list of model-perfect women who never stayed longer than a season. People envied him, feared him, even worshipped him, but what no one realized, what even Santiago refused to admit, was that none of it felt real. His victories had become routine, his relationships transactional, the thrill of success had faded, leaving behind a gnawing question he couldn't shake. What was the point of it all? The answer, it seemed, wasn't in another business deal or another meaningless affair. It came in the form of a bet. A stupid, reckless bet that should have meant nothing. It started at a private lounge in Manhattan, a place where the elite played with power like it was a game, because to them it was a fellow billionaire boasted about his latest conquest, an affair turned scandal, a woman who walked away with half his fortune. The room laughed, because that's what men like them did. Mocked, conquered, and moved on. Santiago barely smirked, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Was this really all there was? These men had more money than they could spend in a lifetime, yet their lives felt small. They chased the same women, made the same deals, told the same stories, and suddenly, Santiago felt tired of it all. That's when Julian, his oldest friend, leaned in with a smirk. "You're bored, Ferrer, admit it." Santiago didn't deny it. Julian saw the opening and went for the kill. "All right, let's make things interesting." He set down his drink, eyes gleaming. "I bet you wouldn't last 6 months married to a woman completely outside your world. Someone real." Santiago arched a brow, unimpressed. "What's the catch?" Julian's grin widened. "No models, no gold diggers, no financial benefits, just marriage, 6 months." The room laughed, waiting for Santiago to brush it off. But something about the challenge stirred something in him. It wasn't just about winning. It was about proving something to himself. Could he survive without his money doing the work for him? Could he be more than just a billionaire? His pride wouldn't let him walk away. "Fine," he said, setting down his glass. "I'll do it." The laughter turned into stunned silence. Julian grinned, leaning back. "Perfect. I even have the woman in mind." Santiago should have known then that he was walking into something far bigger than a game. Because when Julian said the name, the air seemed to shift. Valeria Montemayor, not just a woman, not just a challenge, but the person who would change everything. Santiago Ferrer didn't believe in fate, but at that moment, it felt like the universe was laughing at him. Valeria Montemayor, he vaguely remembered her, Julian's younger sister. The quiet one who used to disappear into books while the rest of them chased ambition. A university professor, an activist, a woman so far removed from his world that she might as well have lived on a different planet. And now, Julian expected him to marry her. Santiago scoffed, "You can't be serious," but Julian only grinned, knowing exactly what he was doing. Why, afraid she'll be the first woman who doesn't fall for your charm? The challenge was clear. Santiago never backed down from a challenge. And yet, this wasn't just about proving Julian wrong. It was about proving to himself that he could step outside his perfectly controlled world and come out unscathed. He had won corporate battles that reshaped industries. How hard could one woman be? 6 months wasn't forever. It was nothing. He would tolerate her, play the part, and walk away victorious. But first, he had to convince her, and that, as he quickly learned, was going to be much harder than he expected. The first time he called, Valeria didn't even pick up. The second time, she answered with a clipped, "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." When he finally got her to listen, she didn't bother hiding her irritation. "You want to what?" she repeated, as if she had misheard him. Santiago sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "It's a marriage, temporary, a contract, nothing more." Silence, then a laugh, sharp, amused, and entirely unimpressed. "You have got to be kidding me." She didn't refuse outright, but she made him work for it. "Why would I agree to this?" she asked. It was a fair question. Santiago could have lied, given some noble reason, but he had the feeling she'd see right through it, so he gave her the truth, or at least part of it. "Because you don't care about money, and I need someone who won't." It wasn't the full story, but it was enough to make her pause. Valeria didn't say yes immediately. She made her own conditions. She would not leave her job. She would not become a billionaire's accessory, and she would not pretend to be something she wasn't. Santiago agreed, thinking it would make no difference. He didn't realize that by accepting her terms, he was stepping into a world where his money, his power, and his charm meant absolutely nothing, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was the one in control. Santiago Ferrer was used to women who played by his rules. Valeria Montemayor didn't even acknowledge the game. From the moment she agreed to the marriage, she made it clear this wasn't about romance. Money or status, she wouldn't move into his penthouse. She wouldn't attend meaningless high society galas, and she wouldn't pretend to be something she wasn't. Santiago had expected resistance, but he hadn't expected her indifference. The wedding was nothing like the grand spectacles he was used to. No designer gown, no lavish ballroom, no paparazzi waiting outside. Just a simple courthouse ceremony. Valeria in a modest dress, Santiago in a tailored suit that suddenly felt out of place. No vows of love, no illusions, just a contract and a signature. And yet, as he looked at the woman standing beside him, head held high, completely unimpressed by the weight of his name, Santiago felt something strange, a flicker of uncertainty. The media went into a frenzy. Billionaire's shocking marriage to an ordinary woman. The business world whispered behind his back. His investors were confused. His exes were furious. Everyone wanted to know why Santiago Ferrer, one of the most powerful men in the country, had married a woman who didn't fit the mold. But Valeria didn't care. She ignored the headlines, the rumors, the attention, while Santiago's world gossiped about her. She went back to work, back to her students, back to her normal life, as if marrying him had been nothing more than an inconvenience that more than anything unsettled him. He was Santiago Ferrer. Women fought for his attention, sculpted themselves into perfection for a chance to stand by his side. But Valeria, she barely acknowledged his existence outside of their agreement. If he hadn't been the one to propose this arrangement, he would have sworn she regretted it more than he did. And so, Santiago did what he did best. He tested her. He left expensive gifts in places she'd find them. Jewelry, designer clothes, luxury trips. She returned them all. He invited her to elite social gatherings. She didn't show up. He tried to pull her into his world, just to see if she would bend, if she would break. But Valeria Montemayor did not break. If anything, it was Santiago who started to feel unsteady. He had expected to tolerate her, to endure the 6 months and move on unscathed. But the more she resisted him, the more he found himself watching her, noticing things. The way she spoke with passion about her students, the way her eyes lit up when she debated an idea, the way she refused to let anyone, not even him, define her worth. He had married her for a bet, but suddenly, Santiago wasn't sure if he was the one being tested from the outside. Santiago and Valeria were husband and wife, but inside the walls of their home, they were strangers. Their marriage was nothing more than an agreement, a transaction that neither of them cared to pretend was real. No romance, no affection. Just two people sharing a last name, and yet Santiago had never felt this unsettled in his own house. Their worlds remained separate. Santiago spent his evenings at high-stakes business meetings, sealing multi-million-dollar deals. Valeria stayed late at the university, mentoring students and working on projects that had nothing to do with him. They shared a space, but never a moment, in the mornings. She drank her coffee in silence, buried in a book, while he scrolled through financial reports. At night, she disappeared into her own room without a word. Santiago had never lived with a woman who wasn't interested in him. At first, he had found it amusing. He had assumed she would adjust, that sooner or later, she would acknowledge his presence, but Valeria was different. She didn't fight with him. She didn't engage. She simply existed beside him, untouched by his presence, as if he were just another piece of furniture in the house. It was infuriating. So Santiago pushed, not out of love, not out of care, but out of pure frustration. He made comments, teasing her about her simple wardrobe, her preference for quiet nights over extravagant parties. She never took the bait. He left luxury invitations on the counter. She ignored them when he finally asked, voice dripping with sarcasm, "How does it feel to be the first woman in history not interested in my wealth?" She didn't even glance up from her book. "I wouldn't know. I've never been interested in anyone's wealth." That should have been the end of it. Santiago had won battles against corporate giants, outmaneuvered the world's most ruthless businessmen, but somehow he was losing a fight in his own home. He had agreed to a marriage without love, without expectations, and yet something about Valeria's complete indifference unsettled him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't attraction. It was the unfamiliar feeling of being insignificant, of standing next to a woman who didn't need him, didn't admire him, didn't even resent him. He had never been ignored before, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. But one thing was certain. This marriage was supposed to be easy, and yet somehow it was starting to feel like his most complicated challenge yet. Santiago had always believed that money ruled everything. He lived in a world where influence was bought, respect was earned through power, and success was measured in wealth. Valeria lived in a world where none of that mattered, and the longer they remained in this strange, tension-filled marriage, the more Santiago realized just how incompatible their realities were. He tried to introduce her to his world, assuming that, eventually, she would find herself impressed. He invited her to high-profile galas, charity events filled with the country's elite. These were the places where power shifted with a handshake, where billionaires dictated the future over expensive wine. But Valeria wasn't interested. At one event, she sat at their table, arms crossed, watching as wealthy executives congratulated themselves on giving back. Santiago noticed her unimpressed stare. "Something wrong?" he asked. She tilted her head, voice calm but sharp. "It's fascinating how much money people spend to convince themselves they're generous." Her words stayed with him longer than they should have. Still, he refused to accept that his world wasn't the superior one. So, when Valeria invited him to hers, he went, if only to prove a point. She brought him to an overcrowded public school where teachers struggled with outdated books and students lacked basic resources. It was a stark contrast to the pristine boardroom Santiago ruled over. One teacher looked at him, unimpressed. "You're one of those billionaires, right?" Before Santiago could answer, the man scoffed. "Tell me, how much of your fortune would it take to fix this?" Santiago had no response. For the first time, he didn't have a quick solution, a clever rebuttal. He had spent years convincing himself that wealth made the world better, that the economy rewarded those who worked for it. But looking around, he realized that maybe the world wasn't as simple as he had believed. Their arguments became more frequent after that. Santiago accused Valeria of being naive, of seeing the world in black and white. She accused him of being blind, of thinking wealth erased responsibility. He was used to winning debates, but Valeria wasn't a business opponent. She didn't play by the same rules, because for her, this wasn't a game. And yet, despite the tension, Santiago found himself listening. He caught himself questioning things he had once believed to be absolute. Valeria, in her quiet defiance, was forcing him to see his world through a different lens, and he hated that it unsettled him. But what Santiago didn't realize was that soon he wouldn't just be questioning theories or abstract ideas. Soon the very foundation of his empire would be shaken, and when the truth was revealed, neither of them would walk away unchanged. Santiago Ferrer had always controlled the narrative. In his world, perception was everything. He knew how to command attention, how to make people believe in the image he crafted. But tonight, he wasn't the center of attention. Tonight, all eyes were on Valeria. And for the first time, Santiago wasn't sure how he felt about it. The gala was a grand affair, a room filled with the wealthiest, most influential figures in the business world. Santiago had attended events like this 1,000 times before. He knew the routine. Smiles, handshakes, strategic conversations. He hadn't expected Valeria to be anything more than an outsider, an observer, but she had other plans. The moment she spoke, the entire room shifted. A panel discussion on corporate responsibility had begun, a predictable parade of executives patting themselves on the back. Santiago barely listened until Valeria took the microphone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were sharp, precise, cutting through the rehearsed speeches like a blade. "If corporate philanthropy actually worked," she said, her tone measured, "then why are the same people still in power while the people they claim to help remain powerless?" Silence. Eyes turned toward her, some intrigued, others irritated. Santiago watched as some of the most powerful people in the country stiffened under her scrutiny. One executive chuckled, an attempt to dismiss her. "That's an awfully cynical view." Valeria didn't hesitate. "No, it's a factual one. Donations that come with conditions aren't generosity, they're leverage. If you want to help people, try doing it without expecting something in return." The shift in the room was unmistakable. She wasn't just questioning their ethics. She was exposing their hypocrisy. Santiago had never seen anything like it. She had walked into a world that wasn't hers, a world that thrived on power and pretense. And she had dismantled it in minutes. He had expected her to endure the night, maybe even argue a little, but he hadn't expected her to dominate. After the event, people approached her. Not to challenge her, but to listen. Investors who had never looked beyond profit margins suddenly wanted to hear what she had to say. Santiago had built an empire through money and influence. Valeria had just done it with nothing but truth. But admiration wasn't enough to erase reality, because soon Santiago would discover that his own company, his empire, was guilty of everything Valeria had just exposed. And when the truth came out, he wouldn't just lose her respect, he would lose himself. Santiago Ferrer had spent years mastering control over markets, over negotiations, over his own carefully curated image, but in a matter of days, he lost control over everything. It started with an investigation. A journalist, emboldened by Valeria's words at the gala, dug deeper into Ferrer Holdings. What they uncovered was worse than Santiago could have imagined. His company wasn't just complicit in unethical business practices. It had directly contributed to the downfall of educational programs Valeria had fought to protect. The headlines were brutal. Billionaire profits while schools shut down. Ferrer Holdings prioritized real estate over children's futures. Santiago had built his wealth on expansion, acquiring land for high-end developments. What he hadn't realized, what no one had told him, was that some of those acquisitions had led to the closure of community schools. Schools that Valeria had once fought to keep open. When she found out, she didn't yell, she didn't rage. She simply looked at him with something worse than anger, disappointment. "Tell me you didn't know." Santiago opened his mouth, but no words came out, because the truth was he hadn't known, but he hadn't cared enough to ask. The fallout was immediate. Investors pulled back. Public trust in Ferrer Holdings plummeted. His board of directors called for damage control, urging him to release a statement shifting the blame. That was how the game was played. Protect the company at all costs. But Santiago couldn't ignore the fact that the woman he had married, the woman he had started to admire, now saw him as the very thing she had spent her life fighting against. For the first time, Santiago didn't want to fix this with money. He didn't want to spin the narrative. He wanted to undo the damage. But how could he? How do you repair something that was built on destruction? As he stood in his office, staring at the reports that exposed his company's sins, one thought consumed him. If he didn't change things now, he wasn't just going to lose his reputation. He was going to lose Valeria. Santiago had spent his career believing he was in control of his own success. Every victory, every billion-dollar deal, every strategic acquisition, all of it had been earned through intelligence and hard work. But as he dug deeper into Ferrer Holdings' past, he realized his empire had been built on someone else's ruin. It started with a single document, a forgotten acquisition buried in old files. Years ago, Ferrer Holdings had played a direct role in the collapse of Montemayor Publishing, Valeria's father's company. Santiago's firm had bought out the publishing house's creditors, forcing them into bankruptcy. To Santiago, it had been just another business move. To Valeria's family, it had been the end of everything. He had heard pieces of the story before, how her father had lost his company, how her family had struggled afterward. But he had never connected the dots, never realized that the man who had raised Valeria, the man who had instilled in her the values she lived by, had been destroyed by the very corporation Santiago now owned. The weight of it made him sick. This wasn't just about bad investments or unethical business deals. This was personal. He had married a woman whose family had suffered at his hands, and she didn't even know. He could keep it from her, bury the truth, let it stay hidden. But the thought of Valeria looking at him with the same disappointment she had the night of the scandal, the thought of her realizing, too late, that he had been the enemy all along, was unbearable. For the first time, Santiago faced a question he didn't know how to answer. What mattered more, his pride or the truth? He had spent years convincing himself that the past didn't define him, but maybe it was time to stop running from it. So he made a choice. If he couldn't undo what had been done, then he would do the only thing that mattered now. He would fix it. Santiago Ferrer had spent his life fixing problems with money, but this wasn't a problem money could fix. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the damage his empire had caused. But he could rebuild what had been lost, and for the first time, he wanted to do it. Not for his reputation, not to win, but because it was the right thing to do. He tracked down the remnants of Montemayor Publishing. Most of it had been dismantled, sold off in pieces. Its legacy erased, but Santiago was relentless. He found the rights to the books that had been buried, the authors whose works had been lost. One by one, he bought them back, not as assets, but as a promise. He did it quietly. No press releases, no headlines, no Ferrer Holdings logos stamped on the foundation he built in its place. It wasn't about proving himself. It was about restoring something that should have never been destroyed. The Montemayor Foundation was born, dedicated to literature, education, and giving voices back to those who had been silenced, and Santiago made sure his name was nowhere on it. Valeria found out anyway, not from him, but from an old friend of her father's. Who connected the dots, she confronted him, her voice unreadable. Why? Santiago met her gaze. No arrogance, no excuses. Because it should have never been taken away. For the first time, he wasn't speaking as a businessman. He was speaking as a man who understood what loss meant. She didn't thank him. She didn't forgive him. Not yet. But she didn't walk away either, and that, more than anything, told Santiago that maybe, just maybe, he was finally on the right path. Redemption wasn't a single act, it was a choice, made over and over again, and Santiago was willing to keep choosing it, for as long as it took, because for the first time, he wanted to be the kind of man who deserved forgiveness. Santiago Ferrer had built his empire on power and profit. Now he was tearing it apart, piece by piece. Ferrer Holdings had always been a titan in the business world, thriving on aggressive acquisitions and market dominance. But that era was over. Santiago stood in the boardroom, facing a group of men who had once respected him. Now they looked at him like he had lost his mind. "We're restructuring," he announced, "effective immediately. Ferrer Holdings will prioritize ethical investments. We will reinvest in education, support small businesses, and operate with full transparency." The room fell into stunned silence. Then the resistance came. "You can't be serious, Ferrer. You'll drive this company into the ground. Philanthropy doesn't pay the bills." Santiago expected their pushback. He had spent years teaching these men that success meant winning at all costs. Now he was asking them to rewrite the rules, but he wasn't backing down. "If you don't like it, leave," he said simply. Some did. Investors pulled out. Stockholders panicked. But for the first time, Santiago didn't care, because something unexpected happened. New investors stepped in, people who had always wanted to support meaningful change but never trusted a corporate giant to do it. Ferrer Holdings wasn't dying, it was evolving, and Santiago knew that if this transformation succeeded, it wouldn't just be about business, it would be about proving that power didn't have to come at the expense of people. Valeria watched from a distance, both skeptical and intrigued. She had spent her life fighting men like Santiago. But what if, for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone? What if, instead of tearing his empire down, she was watching him rebuild it into something worth believing in? But even as Ferrer Holdings transformed, one question remained. Would it be enough to change the way Valeria saw him, or had he realized too late that she was the one thing he couldn't afford to lose? Santiago Ferrer had spent his life avoiding vulnerability. Love had never been part of the equation. Relationships were calculated, fleeting, disposable. Until Valeria, he hadn't noticed it at first, the way things had shifted between them. How silence turned into conversation, how indifference turned into curiosity. Valeria, once a woman he had dismissed as an obligation, had become someone he respected, someone he admired, someone he wanted. But Valeria wasn't easy to win. She had seen the worst of him, had stood against everything he once represented. He had changed. But was it enough? Santiago wasn't used to uncertainty. Yet here he was, standing in front of her, offering something he had never given anyone before. No contracts, no bets, just us. The words felt foreign on his tongue. He wasn't asking her to stay because of obligation. He was asking her to choose him. Valeria didn't answer right away. Santiago had spent years bending the world to his will. But this was different. He couldn't negotiate his way into her heart. He had to earn it, and so he did the only thing he could. He waited when she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but certain. "You're not the same man I married." A pause, then, "Maybe that's why I'm saying yes." Santiago had won many battles in his life. But this was the only victory that ever mattered. Santiago Ferrer had spent years chasing power, but nothing had ever prepared him for this moment. Sitting across from Valeria, a small envelope on the table between them, he felt something foreign. Uncertainty. Valeria didn't speak at first. She simply pushed the envelope toward him. Her expression unreadable. Santiago hesitated before picking it up, his heartbeat strangely unsteady. Inside was a single piece of paper. One word: pregnant. He stared at it, his mind momentarily blank. He had built billion-dollar companies, controlled industries, shaped economies. But this was something he had never even considered. The weight of it hit him all at once. He wasn't just building a future anymore. He was responsible for one. For the first time in his life, Santiago wasn't thinking about money, power, or legacy. He was thinking about late-night stories, scraped knees, a small hand gripping his finger, a family, and it terrified him. Because he had no idea how to be a father, Valeria watched him closely, searching for something in his expression. Maybe she expected him to panic, to see this as a burden. But all Santiago could think about was how much he wanted this to be real. He reached for her hand, his grip steady. "We do this together." And in that moment, Santiago knew this wasn't just a new chapter. This was the only story that ever mattered. Santiago Ferrer had spent his life chasing success. But for the first time, he was thinking about what he would leave behind, not just for his child, not just for Valeria, but for the world. The Montemayor Foundation became more than just a symbol of redemption. It became a force for change. What started as a tribute to Valeria's father grew into something far bigger. A movement that supported education, funded libraries, and gave voices to those who had been silenced. And Santiago made sure it thrived, not as a businessman protecting his reputation, but as a man determined to build something real. Ferrer Holdings had transformed, but so had he. His name, once synonymous with ruthless ambition, now carried weight for a different reason. He had spent his life taking, now he was giving back. And this time, he wasn't looking for recognition. He was looking for impact. One evening, as they walked through a newly opened school funded by the foundation, Santiago turned to Valeria. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" She smirked, shaking her head. "Not in a million years." But here they were, not as enemies, not as a bet gone wrong, but as two people who had rebuilt something out of the wreckage. And Santiago knew this was the legacy that mattered. Because power fades, money runs out, but what you build, what you change, that lasts forever. And this was only the beginning. Santiago Ferrer thought power and money were everything, until he realized they meant nothing without purpose. He had spent his life controlling people, winning battles, and building an empire. But in the end, his greatest victory wasn't in business. It was in choosing to become a better man. But now, the question isn't about him. It's about you. How often do we chase things that leave us empty? Success, status, the illusion of control. We convince ourselves that we're winning. But deep down, we know something is missing. What are you building? A legacy of wealth, or a legacy that actually matters? Santiago had to lose himself to find the answer. But you don't have to wait for regret to make a change. Look at your own life. Are you making choices that truly fulfill you, or are you stuck in a cycle of empty victories? If this story made you think, if it challenged you even a little, then don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and stay connected, because transformation isn't a one-time event. It's a decision made every single day. And when your story is told, what will people remember? That you had money, or that you made an impact?